Hi folks, we're going to look at the Hegalians, Hegelian philosophy. We're reading from page 124 from this book, The Mystery of Reason by Paul Hafner. And we're just going to read about the Hegelians. He writes, Kant's German disciple Fichte, Schelling and Hegel disciples drifted into pantheism. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel in 1770 to 1831 represented the apex of German idealism and immanentism in dialectical system. Being was characterized in its development by three stages: being thesis, and non-being antithesis, and becoming a synthesis. In other words, the preceding entity being is affirmed with its opposite non-being and a higher entity becoming. Hegel founded a new concept of reality as the realization and the overcoming opposites, being, non-being and synthesis. For Aristotle, the principle of identity could be formulated because the concept of being is always the same, as A is equal to A, and A cannot be negation of non-A at the same time and in any same respect. According to Hegel, this logic is faulty because it misrepresents reality. For him, reality is never identified with itself, but at every moment changes, passing from what is to what is not. Thus Hegel's philosophy is essentially contradictory. He proposed that the state is the living God who consecrates himself in the spirit of the people, the national spirit. The living God incarnates himself now in this, now in that nation, according as the nation realizes more perfectly than any other the ideal civilization. Hegel's views cannot be easily clarified, chiefly because they are so obscure. He believed in something called the absolute idea, and some of his conservative followers, known as the right Hegelians, had no difficulty identifying the absolute idea with a personal God. Excuse me. However, his most famous students, known as left Hegelians, were outspoken atheists. They included Marx, Engels, and Feuerbach. Hegel's concept of reality is immanentist, pantheist, and tends towards non-theism. Faith was reduced to human confidence, subordinated or ancillary to science, reason, and progeny. In the Hegelian idealism of the right to the state, or in the averted Hegelian dialectical materialism of the left, to service of the proletariat of the world. What's interesting there is you have Kant, and Kant is trying to save science from skepticism of Hume, and yet Kant's epistemological program led to people like Hegel coming up with ideas that are not purely materialistic. So what that tells me is that some people can't live with a purely materialistic world, and so you see often in history agnostics and even atheists trying to have some kind of numinous understanding of the world. That is to say, they feel they need a transcendent experience of nature, that they can't just live with this pure materialism. They almost pushing into some kind of mysticism. You can see that in Dawkins when he talks about there's a grandeur in this theory of evolution. The word grandeur is almost quasi-mystical. I find it interesting how there were two schools of thought. The Hegelians on the right, who thought his absolute idea was about God, and the Hegelians on the left, who talk about trying to develop a materialist understanding of history. I thought that was interesting. I think the thing about Hegel that I think is important is he did have an emphasis on history and how history was moving, and I think a lot of philosophical thinking today doesn't do that. I think talking about history on a grand narrative scale and how that relates to philosophy and having a philosophy of history, very few people today, very few academics and philosophers and thinkers actually think in those terms. And I think if you're going to be an influential intellectual, if you're going to be an influential thinker, you have to have a philosophy of history, and I think Hegel was very key in that. and he was very astute in that. I think Christianity has a philosophy of history. You can see that written in St. Augustine's City of God. Philosophy of history is important because it takes into consideration all that we know now, all that we've known in the past, and brings it all together and gives it a grand scheme that's important to put all the particulars into context. Christianity's philosophy of history is the fall, the corruption of man, the redemption in Christ, and the coming age of Christ coming back. And within that philosophy of history, we can understand our role and place in the world. And I think it's a more consistent philosophy of history than the history that is presented to us through evolution, that doesn't make sense, that is schizophrenic in its application, because the Christian position is that history is ordered to a beginning, middle and end, whereas evolution it's began by chance, but somewhere in this chance process they smuggled in some kind of structure, and so you have structure and chance working together, producing the variability and the complexity of this world. But yet this structure and chance does not have any future aim, does not have any future intention, yet that future intention is often brought in and anthropomorphized. In other words, that human beings put onto the evolutionary concepts of what they want for the future. But there is no real philosophy of history that makes sense, that can account for intention, can account for where history is going. And like I said, any position, any philosophical position that does not really have a philosophy of history is not credible. And what you find is most philosophers today, most intellectuals, will not touch the philosophy of history with a barge pole. And if they do, they have not developed a philosophy of history and how it works with their whole thinking. And that is to their demise. There is a slow revival going on, and maybe a few people are beginning to think about the importance of the philosophy of history. But generally speaking, it's not as on the tables as it used to be, and I think that is a strategic mistake in thinking. Just my thoughts anyway. Alright, thank you for listening and take care.